Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Autistic Transit Fan. It's been quite a while since I last posted a video, and I'm sorry about that, but I've just been busy in my personal life, and there's just been a lot going on, especially regarding things like school, so again, I'm sorry about that. But we're back, and this video might be a bit shorter, but this is just something that I had to get off my chest and just had to talk about, because this is a issue with such an easy fix for the Norwegian Railways. They just, again, needed to get off my chest. So, with that being said, today we're going to be talking all about single track sections and how to improve frequency on them in a very, very easy and very cheap way. This all started back in summer of last year when I started a NIMBY Rails playthrough where I was going to build the entire rail network of Norway and then turn it into a fantasy map with all my proposed ideas and plans that I wanted to do. And recently, during this playthrough, where I've already finished doing every single rail line in Norway, and now I'm getting on to upgrades, I noticed when trying to run my intercity trains, they would constantly be arriving late because they would have to wait for other trains to pass them. Now, I knew that this wasn't that big of a deal because, after all, Norway's rail network has a lot, and I mean a lot, of single-track sections. It's mostly single-track, in fact, with passing loops at stations. But the one issue that I noticed constantly that was definitely amplifying these delays was that a lot of stations on the network that have passing loops only have a platform on one side. And to explain how bad of an issue that is, I have decided to pull out my model railway set to help you understand. Here is a traditional station with passing loops. You can see that there are platforms on both tracks. That way, trains can pull into either platform, unload passengers, while simultaneously allowing to overtake the other train. Now, this is all well and good. No issues, trains can pass each other, bada bing, bada boom, thumbs up for me. However, most stations with passing loops in Norway only have a platform for one of the tracks. So if both trains want to stop at said station at the same time, it's not going to go well. The only advantage created by this setup is that express trains and freight trains can bypass stopping trains. But what that then does is it creates a setup where instead of having a passing loop where one track is for each direction, you then just create two parallel sections of single track where trains can't pass each other in either direction. So, not a good setup. Now, this is a pretty bad design, and I could excuse it if this was only at maybe one or two stations, but this is an insanely common design choice that I've seen at countless stations across the Norwegian railway network. The most stark example of where this is an issue is on the Bergen line, where literally every station between Voss and Geilo, with the exception of Myrdal, that has two or more tracks, uses this setup where only one of them has a platform. And this creates a huge amount of delay and congestion on the section and vastly limits the frequency at which train service can operate. At a few of these stations, it can be the case where express trains can use the passing loop setup, where they'll use one of the tracks for going one direction and the other for going the other, but you can't do that for the local trains because in both directions they need to stop there. So, yeah, it's a pretty big issue that this is prevalent at, again, every single double-track station between Voss and Geilo, with the exception of Myrdal. And then this whole thing is made like 20 times worse by the fact that it's not just the Bergen line that suffers from this. In fact, every single long-distance train in Norway, and quite a few of the regional ones, have an issue where this setup is prevalent, or at least one station where it has this flawed setup. It's quite a big issue on the Nordland line as well, which is the F7 service between Trondheim and Bodø. And sure, it's not at every single station on the line for a huge stretch. It's usually 2 or 3 stations in a row, followed by a station with a regular setup, and then 2 or 3 more. But it's still a big issue because stations on that line are pretty far spaced apart compared to stations on other lines. So, yeah, it just massively reduces the frequency at which trains can operate. And then this fact is made 10 to 20 times worse by the fact that most stations with passing loops in Norway have more than 2 tracks. They have 3 or 4, because a lot of these stations were built as mini sort of depots where you could store train cars and things like that. So building a second platform at all of these stations really wouldn't impact the capacity of the station that much, because freight trains could still use the depot tracks to bypass the station entirely. So what's the reason for not doing this? Again, there's such a cheap fix here, and that's just building the second platform. And why it hasn't been done baffles me, because this is such a easy thing to do, and it's such a low-cost project. Now, this would be when I usually say something along the lines of, oh, well, it's not as simple as just slapping down an extra platform and calling it a day, but, in this case, it quite literally is just as simple as doing that. I mean, there's not much else that would need to be done. I mean, considering the fact that most of these stations have platforms that can fit a whole train length, otherwise, there wouldn't be a passing loop, so you don't need to extend any passing loops. You don't really need to do upgrades to signaling in most cases. In some stations, you might need to relocate a few signals. The main issue here would be those depot tracks or the yard tracks at some of these stations. Those might need to be shifted back by a few meters, or you might need to cover one up for the platform. But even then, it's very, very minor impact to regular service. The other thing is that this project could be done relatively quickly. I mean, if we were to apply the same sort of philosophy that cities like Melbourne have done for their level crossing removal project, where it's sort of like a similar concept where you have one sort of small-ish fix being applied on a massive scale, and we adopt that same philosophy for this project that I'm proposing here in Norway, I can very easily see a world where we get this done for all the stations in Norway that have this issue in under a year. That brings me over to another point that I noticed when doing my NIMBY Rails build of the Norwegian Railway system. And that is another thing that we are doing a lot of that I think is very alarming, that we need to stop doing, especially for a country of the size of Norway, is reducing rail service when upgrading lines, in the sense that when we upgrade our double track lines in Norway, in the most recent cases, the original alignments have been completely abandoned or ripped up or had their stations closed in most cases. And I find this very, very, very concerning, because we're basically just throwing away extra capacity. And I think, especially for a country that has so much single track on its rail network, capacity is something that you really, really, really need. And I think it'd be great to have keep having these older rail alignments that, while they might be more bendy, it might be slower, that still means that they would work great for something like freight, which doesn't need a high-speed 250 kilometer an hour corridor, and which can't really reasonably operate at such a speed, or doesn't usually reasonably operate at such a speed. But the biggest issue I have with these closing of old alignments is the fact that in a lot of cases it has meant the closing of stations, which is something that I am never a fan of. Even in cases where the stations are sort of replaced by another station that's kind of nearby, I still don't think that it's the best option. For example, if we were to take the proposed Grenland line, I talked about that in my Fixing Railways in Norway series in the second video, where I said that I would also implement a regional service between Kongsberg and Kristiansand to sort of replace service on the line that would be closed, specifically the station at Gjerstad, which wouldn't be included even with the branch to Kragerø being reactivated. And I'm seeing sort of a similar thing play out on projects all over the country, from the realignment of the Vestfold line, which is going to close the station at Skoppum, to be replaced with a station at Horten, which isn't really at Horten and is actually further from Horten than the Skoppum station was. And then even further into the future, you're looking at the closure of the Trengereid station on the Bergen line between Arna and Vaksdal. The biggest issue with the closure of those two stations is the fact that, well, they're going to be bypassed by a newer double track, higher speed section of track. And it's going to be a lot harder to justify maintaining a station on a bypass that would barely see any more passenger service, if any. But I think that all those stations would still deserve to get passenger service. It doesn't have to be at the original frequency, but they should definitely still get at least something, because when it comes to places like, for example, Trengereid, when their station gets bypassed, unlike the people in Skopum and Horten, they're not going to have a nearby station to go to. Trengereid station was the only station in that little tiny area that they had, because the tracks are just going to bypass it in a tunnel pretty far underground. So they don't get a replacement stop. They just lose their station. I don't think that's fair to them. I mean, if Finse gets to keep its station, which I don't think anyone who lives in Finse, well, that's a lie. People that live in Finse probably use it. But my point is, on a sort of ridership standpoint, the ridership for Finse station, excluding tourists, is basically a statistical error. It's very, very insignificant. So if they get to have a station, then why should Trengereid lose theirs? And that brings me to my third and final point, and that is the number one thing that I think that the Railways Norway should be doing after getting these other two projects done, which is keeping your older main lines when you double track and rebuilding your weird passing loop stations that only have one platform. The project after that I think that Norway should be focusing the most on is reinstating the services that it got rid of. For example, the Sørlandsbanen from Kongsvinger to Elverum, which currently only sees freight service, should absolutely see its passenger service reinstated. We need more circumferential lines that make it so that you don't have to go all the way into Oslo and then back out if you want to get from Kongsvinger to Elverum. And then you have other lines, for example, like the line from Nelaug to Åmli, the line down Numedal, which goes all the way to Rødberg, but the tracks have been removed. Another one where the tracks have been removed is the line up to Fagernes, but both of those should definitely be reinstated. And yeah, Norway just has a lot of older rail lines that ended up losing their passenger service in the 80s, like in many other European countries that had rail service cuts around the same time. And it's really a shame, because they really should get their service back. The biggest example that I haven't mentioned yet is probably the line down to Flekkefjord and the line to Grimstad. The Flekkefjord line could basically open tomorrow. Well, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but a lot of it is still in operational order, and it was closed by act of the government. The line to Grimstad would definitely need to be rebuilt. That line hasn't been around for a while, so there's a lot of things in the way of that now, but I still think Grimstad deserves a rail line. So do all the other cities on the south coast of Norway that got cut off from the Sørland line because we wanted to build it inside the mountains where no one is, because then it's protected. But that also then defeats the purpose of building the rail line in the first place, because you're not actually going anywhere. But yeah, rant aside, which is basically what this entire video is, that's going to do it for this quick little video. It's a bit of a yap session. Sorry that I haven't really posted anything big in the last month or so. I've just been busy, and I haven't really had any good video ideas until now. So yeah, drop a comment if you have any other ideas that you'd want me to make a video on. With that being said, I've been the Autistic Transit Fan, and I'll see you in the next video.